Mystical visions, flashy uniforms, exaggerated titles, histrionic attitudes, clamorous faces, and also legends. Sometimes absurd, sometimes gruesome, like the one about acts of cannibalism. Who are we talking about? We're not talking about a comic book character or perhaps a particular antagonist from the James Bond films, so not a product of some writer or screenwriter's imagination. We're talking about a historical figure who actually lived and who, with his very strange and sometimes decidedly disturbing peculiarities, has characterized the history of a part of Africa for several years, leaving a terrible memory in his country and a long trail of blood, in addition to having entered the international scene through extremely controversial episodes. Mystical visions, flashy uniforms, sometimes picturesque and exaggerated titles, histrionic attitudes, sometimes sensational face turns, and also legends, sometimes absurd, sometimes. The story starts on January 25, 1971. We are in Uganda, a former British colony in the heart of equatorial Africa, a colony that has been independent for some time now. That day, it's undergoing a coup d'etat. It's not the only coup d'etat that Africa has experienced in the post-colonial era. If we were to make a list, I think it would take us a few days to detail everything that has happened with successful and unsuccessful military coups. On that day, however, January 25, 1971, a burly soldier who accompanies his real name and surname with a funny nickname. He takes advantage of the temporary absence of Uganda's strongman to seize power. This big, burly soldier, a real ebony giant that the world will come to know. It's Idi Amin Dada, born to a family of Kakwa origin, which is an ethnic group from Basanilo located roughly where southern Sudan is today, and Lugbara, the giants of the jungles located in present-day Congo. Idi Amin's full name is Idi Amin. Amin is his surname, which he adopted after his father, originally Catholic and animist, converted to Sunni Islam. It's a fairly widespread practice, after all. Often and willingly, conversions from one confession to another in that area led to social and economic consequences. They could benefit the career of a head of household who perhaps was looking for space in the colonial society of the time, or even positions in the colonial administration. As it is, it is not. Idi Amin lives a double education, first within his maternal family, and then in a Quranic school. Initially, therefore, he is educated in Catholicism. Then he too converts to Sunni Islam. In 1946, Idi Amin is 21 years old. It's time for military service to be carried out within the armed forces of Great Britain, which still controls the entire region and has not yet granted independence to Uganda. Idi Amin is enlisted in the King's African Rifles, the King's African Riflemen. And these are colonial units made up largely of local soldiers, non-commissioned officers, sometimes local, and white officers who have come from the United Kingdom. Under arms, Idi Amin is first stationed in Somalia and then in Kenya. In the midst of the Mau Mau uprising, which is countered by the English army during a counterinsurgency operation. In Kenya, Idi Amin receives the nickname Dada. Dada is a colloquial word used in various dialects spoken in the Central Africa area and means sister. Why is Idi Amin called Dada, that is sister? Although Idi Amin looks like a big, perhaps naive child, he is actually very cunning. More than once he is caught in the barracks or in the camps in the company of young girls, and he, to avoid punishments, every time says that the girl in his company is Dada, his sister. It's a way to avoid a reprimand, perhaps even arrests, and at the same time continue to entertain relationships with those who are not exactly girlfriends, but are girls who he often willingly calls to his lodgings. Yes, this shows Idi Amin's dual personality. On the outside, jovial, calm, almost to seem stupid. On the inside, however, extremely intelligent and cunning. That big man of almost 2 meters, weighing 120 kilo after finishing his military service, immediately finds a job. He finds a job in Uganda, first as a boxer, so much so that he wins the title of heavyweight champion of Uganda. After all, physique is not taught. If you are lucky enough to have been given an imposing physique by Mother Nature, you can exploit it in many ways. Then, after 1962, when Uganda finally becomes independent, Idi Amin decides to join the Ugandan army, an army that, as often happens in African nations that have recently gained independence, is directly at the service of the powerful man of the moment. Uganda initially is a republic with a very fragile internal democracy. There is the president and former king of Uganda on one side, and Prime Minister Milton Obote on the other. A notable person who studied in England, very intelligent as well, but who cannot stand the English. In fact, we could define him as a fervent anti-colonialist and anti-British. When? In 1964, that is just 2 years after independence, Obote had to face a mutiny. Because the garrison of Jinja, an important city that holds the only bridge over the Nile in the entire country, decided to rise up to obtain promotions and higher pay. Inside that garrison is none other than Idi Amin Dada. Some will say that it was Idi Amin who incited or at least sparked the flame that ignited the fire of the garrison. What is certain is that from that moment, even though the crisis is resolved with the English intervention, an intervention Ovote must request against his wishes. That was Idi Amin Dada's first political act and the start of a rivalry, if not worse, with Ovote. Obote himself, shortly after the events in Jinja, is almost forced to call Idi Amin Dada to the capital. And why? Because Obote is a corrupt man, and corrupt men recognize their own kind and tend to involve them in their affairs or exclude them. They usually start by involving them. Obote understands that Idi Amin is also greedy, so he calls him to get involved in smuggling weapons, ivory and gold, to neighboring Congo, taking advantage of the Simba rebellion in Congo, a sect that aims to massacre all Europeans and return Congo to the old tribal traditions, has set a good part of the country on fire. Uganda also begins to show suffering towards democracy. As we noted, these post-colonial republics are very fragile. So much so that on December 16, 1969, after obtaining full powers and having ousted the old president, Obote is wounded in an assassination attempt. An attack that more than a few say was inspired, if not outright organized, by Idi Amin Dada himself, who, probably to ensure his safety, temporarily leaves Kampala and moves abroad, but not before securing the loyalty of the high ranks of the army. From that moment on, Obote realizes that the common dealings with Idi Amin cannot continue. In fact, the rivalry erupts very strongly. They no longer speak or have any dialogue with each other. When Obote recovers, the only high-ranking military officer he doesn't speak to is Idi Amin Dada, and Idi Amin Dada is planning a way to seize power himself. He takes advantage of a temporary departure of Obote for a Commonwealth summit in Singapore to organize the coup on January 25, 1971, and we could call it an almost bloodless coup, at least compared to those that occur in the rest of Africa, in Congo, in Nigeria, and in other parts of the continent. Yes, because Idi Amin had already gained the army's top leaders' loyalty, and so it really takes him little time to take control of the government, of what is called parliament. But in reality, it's more of a meeting of tribal leaders, the radio, and all the vital nodes of the capital. It really takes very little time. In a day, Idi Amin takes power, and the military hails him as president, while Obote, who is in Singapore, is essentially forced to witness the fait accompli, even though he is contemplating revenge. Obote and Idi Amin's feud will last a long time, but we'll cover that later. Idi Amin Dada's rise to power was a new development in Africa, at first welcomed even by the West. So much so that Idi Amin presents himself as an apparently liberal president who wants to modernize the country, who wants to give a strong Western push to the country. He abolishes the secret police, frees Obote's opponents, and promises elections within a year. And in addition, he launches literacy plans. Quite strangely, after all, it is said that Idi Amin himself can barely read and write. And healthcare plans. It may not be paradise, but it's a big step forward. So much so that Great Britain and Israel are among the first states to recognize Idi Amin's new government and to provide him with material but also financial aid. Yet that famous year to reach free elections never comes. Within a few months, Idi Amin shows his true face. As we were saying, two faces, the jovial, calm, good-natured, friendly one, and that's the first face. Then there's the cunning, cruel face, and it's seen indeed within a few months. The end of the secret police doesn't mean the brutalities have ended. In fact, real death squads are established which day and night apprehend, torture, and kill ordinary citizens, particularly among the Lango and Achioli, groups long supportive of Obote, who has now gone into exile in nearby Antania. Idi Amin therefore behaves like any other dictator, rewarding his friends and suppressing in blood any attempt, even just of protest, or even goes as far as to prevent through death squads, ordering indiscriminate killings. As if that weren't enough, Idi Amin also makes a profound turnaround in international affairs and expels the Israelis, who had even helped him, including rebuilding the international airport terminal in Entebbe. And finally, Idi Amin, in the name of a Muslim Brotherhood, at least that's what he says, he prefers to ally himself with Gaddafi's Libya, a state already defined as rogue in the international arena, which will become even more rogue in the 80s. He backs Palestinian terrorism. From day to night, Uganda goes from being a possible laboratory for a Western-style democracy in the heart of Africa to a sponsor of international terrorism. Yes, I know you're wondering how this is possible. It's simply the brainchild of Idi Amin, who is also seeking approval in the Eastern Bloc. He gets weapons and subsidies shipped from the Soviet Union and its satellites in Europe. He also rejects any relationship with the United States, Canada, or Western Europeans. In the meantime, Idi Amin does not forget his old military friends, those who have been his comrades in arms since the Jinja Revolt. And what does he do? He raises salaries, distributes promotions, buys modern weapons. In short, military expenses skyrocket and begin to strangle Uganda's national budget. Yes, it's a beautiful country. Yes, it has mineral resources, but it's still a post-colonial country. It's still a country with a very fragile economy. And at that moment, Idi Amin has another one of his ideas. He attributes them to mystical night visions in which the Prophet Muhammad, or Allah himself, would appear to him, suggesting what to do. Doctors think it's just part of a delusion due to syphilis contracted in his youth and never fully treated. After expelling the English, Israelis, Europeans, and Americans, Idi Amin targets the Chinese and Indians. Not with China and India he gets along well, but with those citizens of Chinese origin, of Indian origin, who had arrived in the area when the British Empire was still there, and who especially animated the trade and the small Portuguese community. Without them, who are expelled. A presidential decree has sent Uganda's basic economy into an irreversible crisis. Indeed, because there is no way to replace an entire middle class in the short term, there is no way to restart trade and the real economy by suddenly replacing an entire social class. Idi Amin seems not to care. It's fine for him, but he starts making mistakes. The first major mistake occurs in summer 1976. That summer, A Palestine Liberation Organization commando hijacks an Air France plane from Athens to Entebbe on board. The terrorists have taken hostages and are insistently demanding the release of their comrades in arms in Israel, as well as the release of the Rotterdam terrorist in Germany. Israel, as is known, does not negotiate with terrorists and prefers to organize a special operation to free the prisoners. After all, the Entebbe terminal was built by Israeli companies that immediately make the construction plans available to special forces. With those plans, the Israel Defense Forces organizes flash exercises to train the commandos on the interior of the terminal, where the various prisoners have been transferred from the plane. Then a Mercedes is borrowed from an Israeli in Jaffa. Why? Idi Amin not only loved flashy uniforms, changing to a more colorful and decorated one daily, but also had a passion for Mercedes. He always travels with a Mercedes, so the plan is set into motion. The Israel Defense Forces make arrangements with Kenya, which is not exactly a friend of Idi Amin, for an air bridge from Kenya to Tanzania and then to Uganda. They get unloaded from the transport planes. At the edge of the Entebbe runway, a commando team disembarks from the famous Mercedes and escort vehicles, so that the sentries, seeing the Mercedes arrive, think it's one of the usual visits from Idi Amin, who actually, in those days, more than once goes to the end of Entebbe for press conferences to denounce Israeli crimes and to express his full support for the Palestine Liberation Organization. Sure, the fact that Idi Amin has changed the color of his Mercedes initially risks raising the alarm, but the Israelis are extremely efficient. The operation takes place over the short span of one night with only 2 casualties, an officer, Yoni Netanyahu, the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, future Prime Minister of Israel, and a woman who had been posted at the Kampala hospital and whose bed will be found empty days later. It will be learned that she was killed on the orders of Idi Amin as revenge against the Israelis. The Israeli operation is a real success and has wide coverage in the international press. It's a huge blow for Idi Amin Dada, who sees the sovereignty of his state completely violated. Moreover, by whom? By what Idi Amin himself called one of Uganda's worst enemies, Israel. When Kenya and Tanzania's complicity emerges, Idi Amin erupts in rage, and he no longer limits himself to the death squads that continue to rage and kidnap, torture, and kill anyone. No, the increasingly paranoid and verbose dictator decides to invade Tanzania in October 1978. The reason would be a border dispute. Idi Amin, in his lucid madness, claims that an entire province of Tanzania would actually be part of Uganda and would have been taken away during the time of English colonialism, from Livoni back oblivious to the first voices of dissent that begin to timidly rise within Uganda. Idi Amin sets off on an adventure, but it's a real disaster. Idi Amin's army, although armed by the Eastern Bloc, crumbles like snow in the sun. There is no discipline. And when Tanzania counterattacks, supported by Ugandan volunteers loyal to former Prime Minister Milton Obote, the war ends in 6 months. It ends with the arrival of Tanzanian troops in Kampala. Tanzanian troops who, among other things, mourn just 1 tank and a few soldiers lost throughout the campaign, while the Ugandan army is in chaos. Idi Amin flees. He escapes abroad, it is said, with an incredible treasure accumulated over years and years of terror and looting. But above all, his escape opens the book of horror. Everything that happened in Uganda is discovered. In those endless years of dictatorship, they were not difficult years. They were impossible. Secret prisons, torture cells, and mass graves are uncovered. Rumor has it that Idi Amin was even devoted to cannibalism, that he would bite into the hearts and intestines of his victims to gain extraordinary strength or to devour their souls. It was never clear whether these were rumors or reality. The exhumed corpses and discovered skeletons clearly indicate a genocide committed by Idi Amin Dada and his accomplices. Idi Amin seeks refuge in Iraq, then Saudi Arabia, where he keeps part of his treasure. And perhaps for this reason, the Saudi authorities are reluctant to respond to extradition requests coming from Uganda, so that the former dictator can answer for his crimes. What sounds incredible is that from the end of the 70s until his last day on Earth, August 16th, 2003, Idi Amin Dada repeatedly requested to return to Uganda not as a defendant but as a recognized political leader. Madness, megalomania, detachment from reality, not...
We can't say it.
At least not with
certainty. That
one thing is certain. Idi Amin Dada, sometimes nicknamed by Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of neighboring Zaire, has repeatedly tried to negotiate his return. In the end, he prefers to settle permanently in Jeddah with his wives, spending his days in luxury, eating, drinking, talking in a logorrheic manner, and watching Disney cartoons. Yes, that ruthless dictator surprisingly has a good side. He enjoys cartoons. Amazing, right? The trouble with Idi Amin is that his health can't handle the lifestyle. His body weight keeps increasing, reaching 170 kilos. Meanwhile, diabetes emerges, neurosyphilis, which we already talked about, and a form of kidney failure that requires him to have dialysis. On July 20th, 2003, Idi Amin falls into a coma and is admitted to a hospital, while one of his wives pleads for the
Ugandan president
Yoweri Museveni to allow her husband, who is now close to leaving, to be buried in his homeland. The answer is blunt. Whatever the health conditions of Idi Amin, Dana, when and if he crosses the border, he will be called to answer for his crimes. The agony will last a few weeks. It will end, as we said, on August 16th, 2003. Idi Amin Dada will never see the fiery sunsets of Uganda again. But his name will forever be linked to one of the darkest and most brutal genocides in the entire history of Africa. His name will be associated with Entebbe, the military adventure against Tanzania, the madness, the eccentricities, the colorful uniforms, the Mercedes, the endless press conferences, the claims to noble titles, excess, absurdity, laughter, and a foolish, deadly gaze. All this was Idi Amin Dada, the giant of the ebony body, a large but fragile body, which housed a sadistic, diabolical, but also childish mind. Thank you all.